So I will just explain, I think, some of the practicality. Before I introduce Dr. Wheelock, I'll just explain that how this works. So you don't have to do anything except watch at the moment. And if you want to ask a question, I'm sure that some of you will have some questions as we go through this presentation. If you'd like to put your question in one of two places, if you go on your screen, somewhere on your screen, you'll find a pop-up bar which includes Q&A and chat. You'll find that's there, I think, as an option. And you can use either of those options to post a question. So if you want to post a question in chat, please do so, and we'll see that. And what will happen is that then at the end of the presentation, Dr. Wheelock's going to give us some time for to answer questions, which of course is often a very important and interesting part of the whole event, answering people's questions. So that's great. I'm so glad that you could join us. I recognize a lot of these names, and it's lovely to see you on board. It's fabulous. And I just want to special shout out to Declan, because it was Declan, Verner, if you remember, it was Declan that actually put us together in the first place, because I think I was out of the country at the time, and Verner was over giving a talk in Dublin, and Declan, who completed our coach training last year, he went along to the talk and told Verner about me and about the Institute. And so that's how we ended up meeting up in London at one of the shows there recently, the Natural Product Show. And then we decided that we were going to offer the webinar to IINH graduates and also to everyone, basically, who wants to sign up. So this recording, if you want to share it with people, if you want to tell people about it afterwards, you'll find that you'll be able to access the entire recording afterwards. I think it's true to say that it'll be also available separately just as an audio. But of course, because there's so many slides coming up, as you'll see, you'll probably want to watch the slides as well. But the point is that it'll be up there on the website, and you'll be able to access it afterwards and enjoy it and go back through it. So I think what we'll do is, yeah. So as I said, if you've got a question, just please put it in the chat box. And then, as I said, rather than interrupting Dr. Wheelock as he's in full flow, we'll leave that till afterwards, and we'll organise that between us. Nita's online as well, doing the admin and recording, and so we'll make sure that we get through all those questions at the end of it. So this presentation will last around 45 minutes, we think, and then afterwards we'll be able to move to questions and things like that. Now there's a question here from, I just want to check that one. Anna says, the sound is not good. Is that just me? Hi, Anna. I don't know. I don't know. I can't tell it. I think the sound is all right most of the time.
How is the sound?
Because we've been in it before you came on. So if, okay, Nicole, who's in Switzerland, says it's okay. So that's great. Hi, Nicole. And to Irene as well. So occasionally, you know what it's like with broadband and stuff like that. You know, it's just and Wi-Fi, so it goes up and down. But there'll be probably a few moments, but I'm sure you'll get the gist of it. Main points. Okay, great. So I think we're going to start now because we've got over 30 people on board, and this is brilliant. So thank you so much for joining us. We think this is going to be a very important and very interesting presentation from Dr. Verner Wheelock, who, as I said, I've only recently met, and I must say that I was particularly pleased to meet him, not just because of Declan's comments and introductions, but because at the very time that Declan contacted me, I was actually reading the book myself. So, and I really enjoyed it. And I tell you why I enjoyed it, not just because it covers so many vitally important topics in the whole world of nutrition and health, but because it captures all of the important issues in such a concise way, such an up-to-date way. And so basically you've got within one book, you've got basically everything you need to sort of get to the bottom of the core of the issues that are so controversial these days in relation to things like the lipid heart hypothesis, for example, the fact that we've had recommendations for, telling us that low-fat diets are the ideal way to eat for the last 35 years or so. And basically, we need to see through all this sort of stuff, understand what's gone wrong, and then move on from this. And then, of course, Dr. Wheelock will also talk about diabetes and stuff like that. So I highly recommend this book. You can get it on Kindle as well. That's how I got it first. And then, well, I enjoyed it so much, I went out and bought about 10 copies for the, for the library and for various friends and staff members and things like that. So, at the end of this, Verner, I'm going to ask you to choose just one person from the list of names that you'll see, and or just give me a number and we'll count down, and then that person will be sent a copy, a genuine, actual copy signed by you of Healthy Eating, the Big Mistake. So I think what I'll do now is hand over to you, Verner, and you can do the important stuff. And you've already got your PowerPoint up on the screen, so hopefully we can all hear you, and we really look forward to this. So thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard. I'm delighted to have this opportunity because this issue is so important. I use every occasion that I can to help to spread the message. Now, just to start off my story, I was brought up in County Wexford. We lived on a small holding. We had cattle and pigs and sheep. My father was a cattle and sheep dealer. I was then shipped off to the Methodist College in Belfast, where I was a boarder for several years. I then went across the road to Queen's University, where I had a very enjoyable undergraduate and postgraduate career. And anyway, to move fast forward, I eventually ended up in the University of Bradford. And in the late 1970s and 1980s, that's the time that the dietary guidelines were really big news. And at that time, I and many other people accepted that what the great and the good in the nutrition world concluded was actually accurate. I had no reason to doubt it. I assumed these people were all well qualified and well recognized, and therefore that if they came up with the answers, then that must be the way forward. And most of us saw it as a big step forward at the beginning of the 1980s, when the government actually endorsed the recommendations, and essentially that was to reduce fat and increase carbohydrates. And then there's also the story about the saturated fat and the polyunsaturated, which I'll explain a little bit later on. And this was great. We did research with helping industry to implement this and what to do about nutritional labeling and what to do about product formulation. And the retailers in Britain, who, as I'm sure you know, are very powerful, bought into this. And they had nutrition teams that were there to implement the government policy. So everything in the garden was rosy. We're really moving forward, and hopefully there would be a big reduction in, an increased rate of reduction of heart disease as time moved on. However, moving forward a bit to about the beginning of this century, I started to have growing doubts, because basically we're going nowhere. And in particular, and again, remember this is nearly 20 years ago, the incidence of obesity and diabetes, type 2 diabetes that is, was starting to increase. And there was concern about that at the time. And so I began to have my doubts. And then a few years later, my daughter took over our business, and I was able to spend most of my time doing research. And the first significant event really was to read the book by Gary Tobes called Good Calories, Bad Calories in the US. And that was tough going. It took me about 3 reads to begin to get through it. But the more I got digging into this, the more I was convinced that the current dietary guidelines were not working, and if anything, were making things worse. So I decided that I needed to try and explain this to a much wider audience. And then I started a blog and started doing a little bit on social media. And people started picking up on this and reacting to it. So finally, about 4 years ago, I decided I really got to try and put all this into a book. So most of my efforts over the past 3 or 4 years have been devoted to producing this book. Now, originally, I had assumed I would get it off my chest, I would put it on the record, it would go on my CV, and that would be it, and I could move on to something else. However, what really surprised myself and my co-author, Marika Savoras, incidentally, Marika has also co-authored the latest book, The Law of Nutrition, with Professor Tim Noakes. We were absolutely astounded at the response there was to it. And not only people talking to us, but comments on Twitter and the comments on Amazon. Last time I looked, I think there were 27 comments, and they were all 5-star. And what people were saying was really extremely complimentary. So this was beyond our wildest dreams. However, that meant that I couldn't really sit back, and that if it was actually doing the job that in our wildest dreams we had hoped it would, then I've got to get out there and explain it to people. So if we go to the next slide, this is this Eat Well guide in the UK, and you will see it says base our meals on potatoes, bread, rice, pasta, or other starchy carbohydrates. Here is the Irish one, which I'm sure you will all be familiar with. Again, exactly the same, a serving of wholemeal cereals and breads, potato, pasta, and rice at every meal. Now, just as a comment on that, there is not the slightest evidence that we actually need any carbohydrates in our diet. We need protein, we need fats, the various types of fats. We don't need carbohydrates. So basically what had happened was, because the decision was made to reduce fat, the authorities were stuck, and almost by default, they had to advocate an increase in carbohydrates. And now I want to go on and just mention 2 of the key people, and it would be interesting to see whether you're familiar with them. This is Ancel Keys, and I suspect most of you know of him, and we'll come back to him in a minute. And this is Gerald Reaven. And Gerald Reaven is the man behind insulin resistance, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. Well, we now know, if we didn't know before, that Ancel Keys was a charlatan. Although he had established a very good reputation as a physiologist, when he moved into epidemiology, he really didn't have a clue, or shall we say, he manipulated the data. Now, he produced the 7 countries, and I suspect most of you will have heard of that, and that is used as the linchpin for the dietary guidelines. And particularly, this is what happened in America when the Senate produced their report. And in actual fact, what happened then was that most of the other countries in the world took the lead from America. And basically, this is all about cholesterol. And he is saying that if you've got high cholesterol, that's bad news. You've got a high level of CHD mortality. and that your serum cholesterol in middle-aged men are a strong determinant of the CHD risk of mortality 10 or 25 years later. And then the other one was that saturated fat is strongly correlated with the long-term CHD mortality. So basically, that was why cholesterol was identified as a key factor, and why steps should be taken to reduce it by reducing your saturated fat intake, and also by increasing your intake of polyunsaturated fats. Now, I mean, the first thing I should say is that that was a blatant example of cherry picking. So even if the work was well done, the fact is that Keyes had data for 22 countries. And if he had used all of that, then the results would have been all over the place. In other words, there was no relationship between any of the parameters he was talking about. And again, just some of the comments, absolutely damning. You know, it's almost inconceivable the 7-country study was performed with scientific abandon. It is dumbfounding how the National Heart, Lung and Blood Institute and the American Heart Association Alliance ignored such sloppiness in their many rave reviews of the study. Now, Zoe Harcombe, who some of you may know, a few years ago, she pulled together all the randomized controlled trials that had been done on dietary fat in relation to heart disease. And here is her conclusion. She said, no women had been studied, no primary prevention study had been undertaken, no randomized controlled trials had tested the dietary fat recommendations, no RCT concluded that dietary guidelines should be introduced. It seems incomprehensible that dietary advice was introduced for 220 million Americans and 56 million UK citizens, given the country results in a small number of unhealthy men. Now, right about that time, I was fortunate to have the opportunity to visit you know, various international conferences and talk to some of the people who were involved with the dietary guidelines. And the story was, well, we're not actually quite sure, but we really feel it's the results are so positive that it is incumbent on us to introduce some sort of guidelines. But never worry, we've got a major trial coming on, and the results of that will demonstrate without question that the advice that we are given is soundly based. So this was the multiple risk factor intervention study, or the Mr. Fit, which I expect some of you will have heard of. They started off with over 350,000 men between 35 and 57. They selected almost 13,000 who were at high risk of heart disease. They had a special intervention who were given blood pressure treatment, counseled to stop smoking, and dietary advice to lower TC. And then the other group, there was 2 groups, just the special intervention and the controls. The other group was just given the usual care. Now, apart from anything else, this was a lousy experiment, because even if it worked, how are we going to separate out the effect of blood pressure treatment, stopping smoking, and dietary advice to lower TC? So here's what happens 4 years later. This is the all-cause mortality rate per 1,000. The usual care was 40.4. The special intervention was 41.2. In other words, no difference whatsoever. I mean, that is absolutely negligible. And, you know, you can turn and twist it. I mean, even though, as it turns out, the special intervention is slightly higher. And the whole thing was an absolute disaster. And one would have thought that that was a message to all those who were pontificating and promulgating the dietary guidelines. At the very least, they needed to stop and think. But no, the momentum was such that they simply carried on. Then the next study was an attempt to demonstrate that lowering cholesterol was beneficial. It's a bit of a mouthful. It's Lipid Research Clinic's coronary primary prevention trial. And here they had two groups. They had a control group and they had a treatment group which was given a drug called cholestyramine. For all-cause mortality, the death rate, the all-cause mortality was 3.6 in the drug-treated group and 3.7 in the control group. Again, absolutely nothing in it. How anyone could justify that that was a useful and valid result beggars belief. Now, Basil Rifkind, Dr. Basil Rifkind, who was a big wheel in the National Cholesterol Education Program, went onto the media, and what he said was the cholestyramine group had a 19% reduction in the risk of the primary endpoint of definite coronary heart disease, death, or death and non-fatal myocardial infarction. Now, of course, what he is doing here is the usual old trick of switching from absolute values to relative values. And quite frankly, a relative reduction of 19% is really nothing. This did not stop Dr. Rifkind from claiming in Time magazine, it strongly indicates the more you lower your cholesterol and fat in your diet, the more you reduce your risk of heart disease. Absolutely unbelievable. And again, some of the critiques, a guy called Colin, he pointed out that there were, in that trial, they only had men with primary hypercholesterolemia, a rare disease of lipid metabolism that affects at most 1 in 500 of the population and a very small fraction of the total number of people dying of heart disease. The results, insignificant as they were, then extrapolated the entire population without primary hypercholesterolemia. And then Pete Ahrens, who was a critic of all this, said, since this was basically a drug study, we conclude nothing about diet. Such extrapolation is unwarranted, unscientific, and wishful thinking. Now, we come to the recommendation, and by the way, although most of this stuff is based on the UK, from what I can see, very similar conditions apply in Ireland and many other countries as well. My brother-in-law keeps telling me that when he listens to the news about the National Health Service, he can't tell whether it's RT or BBC that he's listening to, because all the problems need to be exactly the same. Anyway, here in the UK, it's 5 millimoles or less for healthy adults, and there's 4 millimoles or less for those at high risk. Now, the simple way to test if this works is to monitor people's cholesterol, follow them until they die, and then you can look at what the cholesterol was when it was measured in middle age or whenever, and relate that to the actual death rate. And the Norwegians have done exactly this in the Hunt-2 study. And starting off with something like 50 or 60,000 people, both men and women, they have got these results. Now again, this may seem a bit of a mouthful, but it's worth looking at carefully. The first thing is that as you get older, your chance of dying increase, so there's nothing surprising about that. But what I'd like you to do is look at the bottom 2 lines, which is where the action is, once people get into their 60s and 70s. Now, if you look across, on the left-hand side, the ones with less than 5 are the ones who comply with the current guidelines. Now then, you can see the blood cholesterol levels increase as you move across to the right. Now, with the 60s, there's really not much difference. But the fact remains that those with less than 5, who are the good boys and girls who have made sure the cholesterol is low, they've actually got the highest death rate. But then, if you look at the final line, there's an even bigger difference. You know, it's about 49 for those who comply with the guidelines, and it's only 41 for those who should be shivering in their shoes because their cholesterol is above 7. And then if we look at the women, again, you know, forget about the first few ones, but if we look at the 60s and 70s, I mean, again, this difference is even greater. I mean, what you see there is that those who comply with the guidelines have got double the death rate of those, this is 60, who have got a cholesterol greater than 7. And again, there's essentially a similar difference when you look at the 70 to 74. But if you are worried about your cholesterol, then I suggest you look at this data. And by the way, this has been repeated time and time again in other parts of the world. And there's absolutely no question about it. So now, let's come to our current problems. Here are the UK figures for the prevalence of diabetes. And, you know, you can just see that it's actually going through the roof. And, I mean, if you look at the women in 1994, it's 1.9. In 2012, it's 4.9. And I understand that the figures for Ireland are much the same. And if we look at obesity, again, we see that this is shooting up, and everybody is very worried about that. And there's all sorts of answers and solutions being put forward as to why this should be the case. Incidentally, none of them have ever worked, in my experience, but trying to get the authorities to accept that what they're doing is totally ineffective is just a major job. Now, we come to diabetes, and I mean, the views across the world are very similar. It is in the NHS choices, which effectively spells out the view of the NHS here in the UK. It says type 2 diabetes is a common condition that causes the level of sugar in the blood to become too high. It's a lifelong condition that can affect your everyday life. Now just let that first one sink in. Type 2 diabetes is a common condition that causes the level of sugar, glucose, in the blood to become too high. What a load of utter rubbish. It's wrong, it's unbelievable. It's the other way around. High blood sugar causes type 2 diabetes. There's absolutely no question about that. You don't need to do randomized control trials to do that. The simple explanation, which if you put it to anybody, they will not question, is that if you have a resistant diet that is high in sugar and carbohydrates, and again, it's not just sugar, it's the glucose which breaks down, it's the starch that breaks down to glucose. If you have a persistently high diet, then of course what happens is that there is a high level of sugar in your blood that the pancreas has to produce insulin in order to get rid of it. By the way, just to give you an illustration, the blood normally contains about a teaspoonful of glucose. If you have a can of Coke or lemonade or something like that, it can be anything from 10 to 15 teaspoons. So just one can of those a day is putting one hell of a strain on your pancreas to produce insulin. Now, I'm not sure if you know about insulin resistance, but basically the body doesn't like too much insulin sloshing around. It wants it to be controlled. And therefore the various organs have to protect themselves. And they do this by developing the condition of insulin resistance. Now, that means that the demand for insulin in order to deal with the blood glucose is increased even more. So basically what you have is steadily increasing pressure on the pancreas to produce the insulin. And eventually it just blows up. It's too much. And it's interesting that engineers have no problem understanding this because they see it as system failure. Now, in order to understand what diabetes is, I've devised this comparison between a flood of water in your house and diabetes, because quite simply, diabetes is simply a flood of sugar in your blood. Whereas obviously a house flood, because somebody left the bath tap on, you've got the water coming in. Now, if you interpret the way diabetes is treated in the same way as a house flood would be treated, the specialists and the advisors say there's no cure for diabetes. What that means is we cannot stop the water coming in. Secondly, you need to look after your health very carefully for the rest of your life. You'll have to cope with the excess water as long as you live in this house. And thirdly, you will need medication to control the blood, the blood glucose. We make sure you have plenty of buckets and mops to cope with the excess water. Now, it is as simple as that, and nobody has yet challenged me on that analogy. And I think, I mean, obviously what that means is that the way in which you deal with type 2 diabetes is you reduce the amount of sugar and carbohydrates in the diet. And there's no question. If you do that, then the disease can be controlled or reversed. There's no question about that. There is ample research. There are any number of case histories on the internet. And we've got our own little group here in Skipton. And believe you me, we've got lots of people who have actually done this and who have improved their health enormously. Now, what I can say is, I don't know anybody who has seriously attempted to reduce the sugar and carbohydrates that hasn't improved their health if they've got type 2 diabetes. Conversely, I have never heard of a single person who has followed the conventional dietary advice, which is to increase carbohydrates and reduce fat. They all get worse. And I keep asking for examples. Blank silence. And the fact is that it just doesn't work, and you don't need to be a rocket scientist to be able to reach that conclusion. But what is so scandalous about it is that people who follow the conventional advice end up getting very, very much worse. As it says, just still on this slide, you will need to look after your health very carefully for the rest of your life. You will need medication to control the blood glucose. It is unbelievable. In my view, it is criminal, because some of those people will have or most of those people, I would say, will have a very poor quality of life. And furthermore, many of them will have their legs chopped off. And in this country, there are about 20 people who have to have that operation every day because of diabetes. Now, again, we get a load of rubbish from the WHO. I mean, it's all there for you. It's talking about reducing saturated fat, achieving adequate intakes of dietary grain, and talking about increasing whole grains. I mean, they do accept that the sugar should be reduced, but it simply beggars belief. Now, just to go over that again very quickly, the primary cause is too much sugar and carbs in the diet. Treatment is no problem once you understand what you do. Reduce the intake of sugar and carbs by replacing with healthy fat. Overwhelming evidence this works very well. But by contrast, the efficient advice is to reduce fat and increase carbs. And here's a case history of somebody who replied to my blog who was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. in 2000, at age 61, he was advised to eat the NHS healthy diet with plenty of starchy carbs, low fat, sugar and salt. He was advised that however well I complied, diabetes was progressive and would lead to problems with eyes, kidneys, possible stroke and heart disease. He was told it's inevitable, the nature of the disease. Sure enough, the disease progressed, reduced kidney function, beginning of retina bleeds, chronic tiredness, and severe crippling peripheral neuropathy. And then he discovered Fergus on the diabetes.co.uk forum, and he gave up all the obvious carbs. My blood sugars immediately improved, and within 3 months I was out of pain and able to play tennis again. Now, after 7.5 years on a low-carb, high-fat diet, I am well without any diabetes complications. I would not dare revert to the NHS Diabetes UK healthy diet. It's poison. Now, one of the stars in this whole field is Dr. David Unwin. And he is a GP based in Southport, which is on Merseyside. And he has his own small GP practice. And about 5 years ago, he was burnt out and thinking seriously of retiring. And then he discovered the work that diabetes.co.uk was doing and started to introduce, started to offer his patients low carb. I mean, basically what David does is he says, right, we can try lifestyle or we can try drugs. Lifestyle means changing your diet and taking a bit more exercise. And surprise, surprise, they all opt for the lifestyle. And David has had huge success. And the great thing is that he's now being widely recognized and has won an NHS Innovator of the Award a couple of years ago. And he's working very closely with the Royal College of General Practitioners to promote this approach. And I'm sure some of you will have come across some of his famous slides where he compares the teaspoons of sugar in the different foods. And again, you can see that some of these foods, which we are told are absolutely healthy, and you must have them, like spaghetti, baked potato, basmati rice, sweet corn, banana. He doesn't like bananas. Have really got an awful lot of teaspoons of sugar. And remember, as I said, the amount you normally need is just 1 teaspoon. So, even a serving of basmati rice puts a lot of pressure on your poor old pancreas. Now, insulin resistance. This is the key. As I said, the body doesn't like excess insulin and sloshing around inside it. And so this condition of insulin resistance develops. Now, this is where Jerry Reven comes in, because he really is the father of insulin resistance. And he has come up with this slide, which just shows you that all the different kinds of conditions that are related to insulin resistance, because basically insulin resistance is damage to the organs, and that can lead to various other conditions. And you can see that even if you don't have diabetes, on the right-hand side, again, insulin resistance syndrome, you can have hypertension, stroke, cancer, sleep apnea. But if you have diabetes as well, because your pancreas is packed up, then there's retinopathy, nephropathy, neuropathy, all these nasty things. Now, let's have a look at what the difference is. Now, what we have here is various clinical events. And on the left-hand side, we have those who have got relatively low insulin resistance. In other words, their insulin is very sensitive. On the right, we have high insulin resistance. And you can see that there are, I think, about 26, 27, maybe even 28 events in those with high insulin resistance. And on the other hand, a little line there, that's actually not. So just ask yourselves which group you want to be in, because if you want to have decent prospects, believe you me, low insulin resistance is the key. Now, we're in the middle of a huge war to get the official dietary guidelines that are the standard practice all over the world. There are an awful lot of people who are working very hard. And this is Professor Tim Noakes, who is an emeritus professor from the University of Cape Town. Now, some of you may know that Tim has been tried on a trumped-up charge because he advised a woman on Twitter that she should wean her baby on meat and 2 veg. And this was all trumped up by the dietitians and various other organizations behind them. And a complaint was made to the body which regulates the medical professions in South Africa. Tim's had to go through a trial which has taken almost 4 years to come to fruition. Now, when the result was first announced, he was totally vindicated, but unbelievably, they have appealed. The appeal's been held, and now we find that although a decision has been made, it hasn't been announced. It was supposed to be announced, I think, by about the beginning of April, but for some reason is being buried. Now, Tim was in London last week, where he gave a magnificent speech just explaining the whole picture there. And I was delighted to be there. And at the end of it, there were 300 people, and he had a 5-minute standing ovation. He's an incredible character, and he is one of the people who is leading the charge to have the dietary guidelines, not just in South Africa, but globally changed. And this is his book, which again has just been published. And again, we have Marika, who's worked very closely with him, who has also worked with me. And there'll be a lot of detail about the trials in the book. And incidentally, one of the chapters written by Marika in my own book gives a brief summary of what's been going on in South Africa. Dr. Asim Malhotra, he's a cardiologist based in London, who's really been fighting the battle very hard. He's got some excellent media coverage, and he is probably the key figure behind the decision to introduce a sugar tax here in the UK. But he really is very switched on and is doing a great job. Anders Infelt, based in Sweden, he runs the Diet Doctor website, which is a fantastic source of information. I would highly recommend it. You should know him, Ivor Cummins from Dublin. Ivor is an engineer, and again, he is making an incredible contribution. It took him 3 weeks to work out that the whole cholesterol theory was rubbish, because he had been diagnosed, he had a high value himself. He's also written the book. I've got the highest regard for Ivor. He's an excellent intellect, and he's doing great work all over the world, including America. Jason Fung, you may have heard of Jason. He's a nephrologist based in Toronto. One of his things is to advocate starvation for short periods. There's no doubt that intermittent dietary management, IDM, that's what he calls it, and he is very successful and very outspoken as well. I just wonder how some of these people get away with it, but they do, and that's great. Gary Fetka in Tasmania, and his wife Belinda. Again, Gary has been in trouble with the authorities. He's a surgeon, but he was giving advice to people on reducing their carbs and finding that as a result, they didn't need the operation. The official body told him that as a surgeon, he had no authority to give any advice on nutrition. Absolutely crazy. Sarah Hallberg, You may have heard of the Verta Health Clinic in the States, which is a commercial venture, but nevertheless being very successful in providing courses and advice that enable people to change their diet and to get over their diabetes. Jeffrey Garber is an American, and again, he collaborates with Ivor Cummins, and the two of them were involved in writing the book. He helps run a conference at Breckenridge, which I think has become an annual event. And here we have Peter Brickner, who I know very well. He is an Australian doctor who's had the most interesting career. For many years, he was the medical advisor to the Liverpool football team, and then he spent some years advising the Australian cricket team on diet and general health. And he tells me that many of their players have switched to a low-carb diet. And he's also just written a book. And finally, a couple of weeks ago, I got a phone call from Alan McEwen, who's an engineer. He had heard about my book in the local newspaper. He'd bought it, and within a few weeks, he'd overcome his diabetes. He discovered that he was his liking for apple juice and liquors of all sorts was his downfall. So he cut those out of his diet, and he feels an awful lot better. So I hope there will be a few more of those. And I think at that point we can probably leave it, and hopefully I've managed to meet the time. So over to you, Richard.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Verner. And I forgot to tell you guys when we started that Verner's been great, because and I think until a few hours ago we weren't quite sure whether he was going to be able to make this, because he's been quite sick for the last few days, haven't you, Verner? And you're actually.
Well, my doc says there's nothing fundamental.
Okay.
Probably got a few years left, yes.
That explains the little bit of coughing and stuff like that. So thank you very much for us not having to cancel or to postpone the event. So it was great, and thank you very much to everyone who stuck with us. And I know that the sound wasn't brilliant right throughout, but I think you probably got the gist of things. You can go back and listen to some of the stuff, of course, the whole thing if you want to, and look at the individual slides. And actually, the book, of course, is you have there. My copy, I don't know where it is. It follows me around the place. I don't know where it is right now, but you've seen the copy anyway. You can see it on the screen there. What I'm going to do is now look at some of the questions. Since you were mentioning some of those people that are so important in the whole movement there, Verner, I just want to point people to a few places and a few books as well that they can find out more information. Possibly one of the best places to go is the Diet Doctor.
I agree.
Dietdoctor.com, and which Verner mentioned there. Another one is diabetes.co.uk.
Yes, not Diabetes UK.
Yeah, not Diabetes UK, but diabetes.co.uk. So these people are, most of them are people who are diabetic or are trying to lose weight by trying a low carb approach. And so they're really disrupting the model seriously. If you want to go to something even more dramatic and have a look at that, go to Verta Health, VIRTA Health, VIRTA Health, VertaHealth.com. And these are guys that have come up with a hugely ambitious plan to cut the number of people with diabetes by, was it 10 million? I think, was it 10 million in the States in the next few years? It's just phenomenal. And go on there and check out their animation, because it's absolutely brilliant. It explains a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about today really, really well. And it's also backed by two of the absolutely most important scientists who've been working with low carb diets for decades. And the guys that I'm talking about here are Professor Jeff Volek and Dr. Stephen Finney. This is the book, one of their books here. If you want to follow up more about this, these guys have conducted hundreds of trials over the last 30 years between them, and they're still doing this work. And these guys are involved with Verter Health as well in America. And so that's a general book there. And the other one, for those who are interested in performance, they have a book there for sports people explaining all this sort of stuff. And of course, there's new research coming out all the time. You can find the stuff you go to Verter Health, you can find out what they're doing now. They're producing more and more videos and more, research material all the time. You also mentioned Jason Fung, Dr. Jason Fung, who is a nephrologist, as you said, who lives in Canada. And that's his book, or one of his books anyway, the recent book, The Obesity Code. It was a very good book. You mentioned, well, you're talking about diabetes. This is a compilation of chapters and articles by a number of people that we have mentioned today. Diabetes Unpacked. It's also a new book, and again, very, very important. Very important that we understand. If we're going to work as coaches, a lot of us are coaches or even nutritional therapists, and it's unavoidable that you will come across lots of people in your work who have diabetes or are pre-diabetic and either know that they are or don't know that they are, but they're showing all the signs. And so you're going to have to work with people like this anyway. And
the thing, Richard, is that what you understand in resistance, it's not just about type 2 diabetes.
Yeah.
That is the key to so many other diseases.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, but I was going to come on to that. So if you go back to that slide of Gerald Raven's slide where it shows the two pathways, yeah, you're going to put that up for us, yeah. That's a really important thing to get your head around. So we'll start thinking about, because this is what brings it back to the cause. It's insulin resistance gives rise to all these problems. And so there's two pathways there. On the left of the screen, you go down to type 2 diabetes, because an inadequate insulin response is going to inevitably lead to high blood sugar levels, and then you get the diagnosis of diabetes and all the things that come with that. But the point is that it's the same basic problem which is leading to these other things like high blood pressure, stroke, polycystic ovary, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and some types of cancer, and things like sleep apnea. There's a lot of people with sleep apnea, and this is worth thinking about as well. So these could be signs. All of these things here, these people may not have diabetes, but it's all caused by the same underlying metabolic dysfunction of insulin resistance, and that was the genius of this work. Don't you agree, Verner?
Yes, I do indeed.
Yeah. Okay. I've got a couple more books here.
I've never heard of insulin resistance.
What's that?
A lot of GPs have never heard of insulin resistance.
Okay. So there's a lot of resistance to insulin resistance. Yeah. Right.
Well, it's certainly ignorance.
Oh, for sure. There sure is a lot of ignorance. You mentioned Professor Tim Noakes, and he's really one of the central heroes in this whole story. And if you can find out more about him or read more about him, you'll only benefit. Here is a book that I've just read recently about him. It's a very good book, and it's not, it's not just about him. It's about the whole way in which science has become, particularly in the area around nutrition, has become rather badly corrupted. And so anyone who's working in the area of nutrition would do well to read this book, because it's very well written indeed. It's a good book. Gary Taubes, you mentioned, some of you have seen me waving this around in the classroom. This is a completely recent book by Gary Taubes, The Case Against Sugar. It's important that, as I said before, that you get an understanding of the basics here, because you're going to run into so many people with diabetes or these other conditions. And there's one we haven't mentioned much at all, but this one, Alzheimer's.
Yes.
And this is, of course, we had a webinar from Amy Berger a couple of months ago. And that, by the way, is still up on our website if you want to listen to that one as well. So Amy did a great job explaining the importance of using, of avoiding carbs, basically, and linking the inability of the brain to utilize sugar to the whole business of insulin resistance in the brain. Absolutely fascinating work. So, yeah, and that's enough of that, I guess. So I think what we'll do now, Verner, is we'll look at some of the questions, shall we? Is that okay? So let's have a look. If there's any questions. Declan says, "Thank you, Verner. Keep fighting the good fight." That's great. Yeah.
Thank you, Declan.
Irene is asking, how can early signs of insulin resistance be detected? Could you answer that, Verner, please?
No, that's a difficult one. I mean, really what we should be doing is monitoring for insulin levels. And it would make much greater sense to spend the money on doing analysis for insulin than it would for cholesterol. I mean, we waste an awful lot of money on the whole cholesterol thing. And of course, the difficult thing is that this can go on for years without manifesting itself in obvious symptoms. And of course, some people can cope very well with lots of carbohydrates, whereas others can't.
Yeah.
I just think that, if you're not sure, then, start cutting out the sugar and carbs. And if you're perfectly healthy, my first piece of advice would be cut out as much sugar as possible.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's important. It is important to say here that we're not advocating that everyone needs to go on a very low carb diet, and I don't believe that myself. I mean, I've lived on a high carb diet most of my life, and I'm okay. But then I've eaten really well. I haven't eaten any refined carbs and very little sugar. I was, after all, a student of Professor Yudkin.
You see, we've got the increase in the consumption of soft drinks. A lot of them are full of sugar, and I mean, I mentioned just an ordinary little can, but of course, many people consume an awful lot more than that.
Oh, for sure, and kids as well.
Exactly. Secondly, we have all these low-fat products.
That's right.
And of course, invariably, what happens is that the fat is removed, and very often it's sugar and/or sweeteners is added.
Yeah, yeah.
And thirdly, we have all the manufactured foods, and an awful lot of them contain sugar because it's cheap, it's a good filler, and arguably it's addictive. So the load of sugar that people are consuming, if they're going into a supermarket and buying the stuff there. I mean, I see people going out But the trouble is, I think, heavens above, these people are going to end up with diabetes if they haven't got it already.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because there's so many people walking around, coming back to this question here, who have insulin resistance, but it's not yet manifest in detectably high blood sugar levels. Because
That's right.
one of the issues here is that essentially the diagnosis of diabetes is based on having high blood sugar levels, high fasting blood sugar levels. But the point is that you can still be insulin resistant. It's what's going on behind the scenes that's important. It may be that you're needing to produce very high levels of insulin in order to keep blood sugar levels down to that safe level. And you don't know, that could have been going on for decades before it actually manifests as high blood sugar. So coming back to your question, Irene, yes, we don't yet, as far as I know, there is no home test for monitoring or detecting insulin resistance. I mean, I'm sure there's lots of people racing to produce a home test for that, but that would be much more useful to know. But I suppose the answer really in practical terms would be, well, what are you noticing about your condition? Are you noticing that you get inflammatory problems around the body in various places? Are you struggling with weight? All these things could be signs of insulin resistance, which is not yet manifest in high blood sugar levels. You see what I mean? So Caroline is saying, how does a low-carb, high-fat diet manifest itself in an everyday diet? How do we know how much or too little to consume? Is there a science to it, or just general rule of thumb? Whole food and fruit, veg.
Or if you want to get out of that level, then you've got to start monitoring your blood sugars.
Yeah.
I mean, I've done a blog which I've just laid down some basic principles. The first one is that you look at your diet and you see where the sources of sugar are, and then try and cut those out. I mean, what we have to understand is that everybody is different, different genetics, different history.
Yeah.
So it may be a bit cop out, but at the end of the day, you've just got to work out what suits you best.
Yeah.
And certainly with our group here, we know that if people are given a blood sugar meter and begin to understand the relationship between what they eat and their blood sugar levels, it soon gives them much greater insight into what's going on inside their body and how it's affected by the food that they eat. And I mean, quite frankly, we find that there can be quite significant differences, even in the same food, between different individuals.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, yeah, but this is a very particular practical question here. If somebody suspects that, say, a family member or a friend or a client is actually insulin resistant, but their blood sugar levels are fine. Yeah, how do you convince them or their doctor to do anything about it? Well, all I would say there, Caroline, was if you can persuade them just to try it for 3 or 4 weeks, to go on a low carb diet. I think that a lot of people will be quite surprised that they start feeling better in some way or other. It might be that their energy levels improve. It might be that they suddenly lose weight that's been very resistant to being lost. That kind of thing. That's often, I mean, ultimately it's how we feel that convinces us of things, isn't it? So I think if you can get people to try things. So, I mean, it may not be possible if someone's, reliant completely on blood tests and things like that and what their doctor says, but, it's a tough one sometimes in practice.
The point you make about weight is very important, because the conventional approach just doesn't work. Calories in, calories. But if you start reducing your carbs and increasing your fat, I mean, if it's going to work for you, and it works for most people, you will know within a week or two.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's not difficult to maintain.
No, that's right. See, I think this is what's going to. this is one single thing or factor is going to make this much more widely recognized and adopted in the next few years. And it's this single thing of hunger. It's so difficult to control your weight if you're eating a lot of carbs. You know, if you have a weight problem, and try and do it by the conventional method of reducing calories, it means eating less food. And if that food is still high in carbs, you're going to be hungry all the time because it's going to fluctuate your blood sugar levels. On a low carb diet, that doesn't happen. And so you just don't feel hungry. And so you eat less. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to count calories. You know, so that's the important thing there. Now, Audrey says, because otherwise we're not talking all night. Audrey says, what's your opinion about advising clients to buy a blood sugar monitor? These are easy to buy, and I often wonder if they can rely on them. Can you answer that one, do you think, please, Verner?
Yes, I would definitely recommend it. Because, as I say, it gives you the insight so that you can understand the relationship between what you're eating and the impact it has on the blood sugar. I mean, when we ran our course here in Skipton at the beginning of last year, we had about 20 on it, and they were all given blood sugar meters. And the way in which they used them was varied. I mean, some took it very serious and were producing fancy graphs and all the rest of it. But there's no doubt that you know, if you have a bit of a scientific bent at all, then that's an attractive way forward. And even if you haven't, it is certainly worth trying.
Good. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thank you. Now, Yolanta says, I have weight problems and diabetes in my family, so I know I'm in high risk. The blood tests are fine so far. I feel extremely hungry without carbs in my diet. I've tried a million times low carb diet. Okay. I think, Yolanta, what it might be a good idea for you to do is to actually, well, of course, you can check out things like the diet doctor, because there'll be lots of forums on there, for example, that you can ask people questions about. Also, the diabetes.co.uk, you might find there's a lot of people who are struggling a bit like you when you try to move into this low carb space, because it's not that easy for some people. You know, to just, you know, it doesn't just happen like that. Some people actually don't feel good for a short while, and because they're in transition, because their metabolism is in transition from a diet where the body's always had plenty of carbs, and so is set up for that, but doesn't have a chance really very often to move to the alternative fuel of fats. So it maybe you just, but that's, you know, that's a advice for a site that you could, a few sites you could check out. But if not, then I think you could perhaps come to the clinic. You know, you've just finished year one. And you could try coming to the clinic if you want, or see a nutritional therapist that you can work with that, because it's definitely important that you do that. And as I said, you might need to be a bit patient and do things a bit gradually. I know it's not as easy as that for some people just to make that switch.
Yeah, I think what I would emphasize is particularly if you're on a high carb diet, just do it gradually, rather than making a big change, because that can cause problems.
Yeah, exactly. I agree.
The other thing is, of course, if you're carbs, make sure you have enough fat in the diet.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Go low carb and low fat.
Yeah.
And of course,
I know Yolanda's been on the course. She's very smart, and I think she understands all this. Yolanda, just to notify you, in case you didn't know, that Maggie is doing a day of low carb cooking. I think on the 11th of June. It's the 11th. So that might be good for you, because you're the kind of person that we created the class for. If you are interested in that, if you're able to attend, I'm just going to check that, make sure it's. If I got this right. No, sorry, the 16th. The 16th of June. If you're interested in that anyway. Okay, now what we're going to do is move to the other block of questions here that some people have used the Q&A section. So Nicole is asking, how does this information relate to the research and recommendations of Montignac in his famous Eat Yourself Slim, which began with his work as a pharma rep with diabetes and glycemic index? Yeah.
I don't know about that, so.
Okay, so I think I've read part of his book, Nicole. I think as far as I know, the Montignac approach is certainly based on mostly on whole foods and things like that. I think it's a bit more like the Atkins approach, and the Atkins approach is different, slightly different from the low carb approach that we're talking about here, because it's more of an emphasis on protein, on high protein diets. Whereas this is not, the low carb approach that we're advocating, I suppose, is not a high protein diet. It's a moderate protein diet. It's high in fat. That's the important thing. And of course, that very notion of being high in fat is enough to freak a lot of people out, the thought of it. But I think that's the main difference. I mean, both approaches will be low carb. We're not talking about ketogenic here, but certainly low carb. But there's two ways. You see, if you lower carb, you can increase protein, or you can increase fat, or both. But the safer way is certainly not to exceed or not to go too high with the protein, and to go with good quality fats instead. And of course, we have to emphasize that it's really important to stick with the notion of whole foods as far as possible, good quality fats. I mean, it's possible to make yourself quite sick if you eat too many poor quality fats and oils as well. So I hope that answers the question there, Nicole. Julianne Brady asks, any info on the Alzheimer's ends of things regarding diet? Well, I think I showed you the book there, didn't I, Julianne? And there's others as well. It's a really good book. It's very readable, this one. It's a very readable book. She wrote this, she's a good writer, and she wrote this for people who don't have really any science background. So it's very readable, this one here.
I think the basic message I'd like to get across is that the diabetes illustrates very neatly that you're not going to solve the problem unless you get to the basic cause. And it's no good fiddling around with drugs, trying to do this, that, and the other, because, you know, as I mentioned, that's just like trying to stop a house flood with mops and buckets. Mm. And there's no doubt that there was growing evidence that sugar is a key factor, and that insulin resistance is a key factor in Alzheimer's. And, you know, quite frankly, you have to take preventive steps. And, you know, it's no good waiting until the disease hits you, because quite frankly, you know, in most cases, that's going to be far too late.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah, totally right. I mean, you know, it's so much easier. We all know this. It's far easier to prevent things than to fix them afterwards. Just look at cancer. You know, so yeah. So I hope that's okay, Julianne. And there's other books as well. There's one by Dr. Dale Bredesen, or Professor Dale Bredesen, who's one of the pioneers working on protocols for Alzheimer's, and he's come out with a book. Actually, I've got it somewhere. See if I can find it for you. Here it is. This one here. You can see that. That's also cutting edge stuff there. New book. So that's great. Thanks for that, Verner. So and Erica. Hi, Erica. So when does Verner think the tipping point will finally be reached? There's a question for you.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I think the only answer is that it will happen. It's not a question of if, but when. Certainly, David Unwin is making progress here with the Royal College of General Practitioners is a big step forward. But believe you me, we mustn't underestimate the resistance, because there are very, very powerful elements out there who don't want this to happen at all, because it's going to be very bad for the business. And that applies particularly to the drug companies and to some extent the food companies. I mean, we haven't talked about statins, but of course the information I've given on cholesterol just blows the case for statins out of the water.
Yeah.
And I mean, that is just another huge, huge scandal.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you didn't have time to cover everything that's in your wonderful book, but there's a great article, it's a great section, chapter on statins, and that's really important information for those of you who are, well, you may be on statins, but people who are on statins, family members or clients. I mean, it's not a question of interfering in the relationship between the patient and the doctor. That's their decisions. That's their that's their choice. But just informing people, because that's our main job, isn't it? As coaches and MTs.
Well, I think the one thing I would say, Richard, is that
Okay.
if you have to have statins, then it's essential that you also are prescribed CoQ10.
Yeah. Well, I tell all the students that.
That's the way it works.
Yeah, yeah.
And I mean, in my view, because of that simple fact, statins should never have been approved, but they have, and they are with us. But you know, all the pressure is building up against them, and it just takes an awful lot to get any kind of action. And you know, coming back to the other question, I mean, we might get a breakthrough in 6 months, but it might be years.
Yeah.
All I can say is that we've all just got to hang in there and do what we can.
Yeah, yeah. Well, actually, there's one analogy that I sometimes think about, Verner. I don't know what you think about this, but you're like me. You're old enough to remember the whole thing about smoking and how we turned against tobacco. And you probably remember back when you were young that that you saw that you found doctors promoting various brands of cigarette because they were good for coughs. You know, remember Craven A?
Oh yes, indeed.
Well, I do, yeah. But it wasn't until doctors themselves, because a lot of doctors smoked in the 60s and 70s, early 70s. A lot of doctors did, and it was only really when doctors themselves stopped smoking that they felt able to start giving this kind of advice about cutting out tobacco. Then it started to work. You know, if your doctor tells you something, then you tend to listen to it, at least for a while. And I think that's when the change began to happen, and people started to think about giving up smoking. And I think that there are now so many people with diabetes that there are also a significant number of doctors with diabetes.
Yes.
And I think, like, you know, Dr. Unwin, among so many who've discovered this, and doctors are powerful. You know, when doctors start throwing their weight around, their opinions, then things start to happen. And I think that there'll be enough doctors who are diabetic and realizing that this approach works for them as well as their patients. And this is when things are really going to start to happen. So I suspect, Erica, that actually it'll be this kind of thing. It'll just be a numbers game ultimately, with just so many people out there who are developing these problems and discovering that there's a better way. So Christina says, I run the Facebook group Keto Island. Thanks. Great. That's lovely, Christina, to know that. I know you're very active in the keto world. So that's super. So the Facebook group Keto Island is really good. So if you want help and advice and support, then that's a great place to be. There's lots of support in this area at the moment. And Christina says he also has a new book, The Diabetes Code. Who's that? Is that are you talking about?
Is that Jason?
Is that Jason? It sounds like it sounds like Jason Fung, is it? Because this one here is the obesity code.
Yes, I think he has done diabetes code.
Yeah, it could well be. Yeah. It sounds like that. So Christine is asking you, Verner, should those with a history of metabolic disease in the family routinely have the Kraft insulin assay test to catch any issues early? Good luck with that. What do you think?
Yes, I would say certainly if they can get it. I mean, that's what
You can get it.
is advocated. Incidentally, Ivor Cummins on his Fat Emperor website has got some excellent YouTube videos with Dr. Kraft.
Yeah.
I haven't come across those, and I would certainly
Yeah, the Fat Emperor is the site to look at. That's Ivor Cummins' site, Irish site, Fat Emperor. And he is particularly into this whole insulin measurement, insulin sort of monitoring thing. Essentially, I've got the book here. Actually, this is Joseph Kraft, Dr. Kraft's book.
That's right. Yes, yes. It's not an easy read.
No, it's not. It's not, and he's not a good writer. But the point is that he was an absolute pioneer. He was the one that made us realize that you could predict people who were going to develop diabetes sometimes decades before that could be detected by a fasting blood glucose test. And that's the point I was trying to make earlier. That's why it's so important to recognize that a high fasting blood sugar level can be actually quite a late stage indicator that you have problems. Yeah? Would you agree, Verner?
Oh, I do, absolutely. So this is why, rather than worrying about taking tests and all the rest of it, if you're perfectly healthy and this makes sense to you, then start making changes right now.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, we're talking about, of course, the most important thing of all is eating good quality food, whether it's high or low carb. I mean, that's the important thing. But I mean, the point is, if you have any kind of history, family history, or indication of early stage problems or weight control problems, then it's certainly worth trying this. And it's not going to do you any harm, that's for sure, as long as you stick to whole foods as far as possible.
To find out if it works for you.
Yes, exactly. Now, Sheila is asking, would you suggest a low-carb diet for a breastfeeding mother?
I don't see why not. No, I can't think of any reason. I mean, in any case, I mean, breast milk is actually a high-fat food. So, yeah, I could see no objection to that.
More meat. As long as, as I said, with a caveat that the food is good. That you
yes. I mean, that's the basic recommendation is people like Zoe Hartman keep saying, just eat real food.
Yeah, exactly. And Sheila knows that too. Good. I hope that's okay, Sheila. A bit of a short answer there. Now, Nikki is asking, number one, in terms of cholesterol, those levels quoted from the NHS guideline is related to LDL levels in the blood, right?
No, cholesterol. They're related to total cholesterol.
Total, yeah. That's what TC was in the slides there. It was total cholesterol. Yeah. But of course, the particular factor which is highlighted when doctors are looking at cholesterol levels is LDL, because that's the only one that can be manipulated by drugs, and that's why the focus is on LDL. But of course, HDL, as we've discussed in the course, is actually a more important thing to monitor. It's a more important thing.
With LDL, we really need to look at the particle size. And if you've got tight, dense particles, then that's bad news. If you've got big, fluffy ones, then that's okay. But I would have said the ones to go for are HDL, triglycerides, and HbA1c.
Yeah, that's right.
If they're all showing okay, I mean that's as good an indication as you get without going into things in much greater detail.
Yeah. I think it's like you were saying earlier. This is just this. If we could move away from cholesterol for a while and start focusing on far more important indicators. We've just been obsessed with cholesterol for 40 years, haven't we?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
It's mad. Yeah. So, but of course, I mean, having said that, Nikki is right. I mean, the fact is that that's what people have been indoctrinated in, and that's what very many doctors are still focused on.
Yes.
So she says, for people that are worried about cholesterol levels due to blood tests from GP, what's the best way to approach this? Will they be okay as long as the diet is healthy in terms of balanced nutrition, and it shouldn't necessarily matter what the number in the test says? Do you want to answer that?
Well, if you really want to know how to vary your cholesterol, then go to the work of Dave Feldman. I think he's Keto Dave. Again, another engineer, and he's been doing a series of experiments on himself and on lots of other people. And I mean, basically, he finds that you can vary your cholesterol quite considerably by changing the level of fat in your diet. But I mean, the basic premise is that you don't need to worry about cholesterol, and there's no evidence to support that, despite all the nonsense we hear. And there are lots of other things that will give you a much better indication of what your general state of health is.
Yeah, and that, I know that's only a partial answer there, Nikki, because I mean, the fact is that some people, especially older people, would be obsessed with cholesterol levels, and also they wouldn't be willing necessarily to challenge their doctor around this. So
yes, I fully understand that, but yet there's more and more evidence coming out that, especially with older people, the higher cholesterol, the better.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely clear from reading your book and looking at other material too. That it's very clear that as you get older, once you get beyond about 60 years old, then longevity is associated quite strongly with higher levels of cholesterol, total cholesterol. So basically, it predicts high cholesterol levels in older age predict better health. And that's true both, as you showed us very clearly from the Norwegian study there. And that applies for women, actually even more for women than men. Yes?
Yes, it does indeed.
Yeah, good. And Julianne says, I'll get the books and have a look at the lecture on the website. Thanks. Okay, that's great. Now, Nikki's asking also, regarding those on statins, what's the advisable level of CoQ10? Is there a 30, 100, or 200 milligram forms?
I can't trot out figures, to be quite honest, but the little bit that I have looked at suggests that as you get older, your CoQ10 level falls.
Yeah.
So that even without being put on statins, there may well be a case for going on a supplement made of CoQ10.
That's right. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. So CoQ10 is made in the cells of our body, and it declines like so many other things that we produce in our bodies decline with age anyway. And then if you take statins, then essentially you block the production of CoQ10.
That's right.
So I suppose, yeah, I couldn't be able to give you an answer on that myself, Nikki, but what I would suggest is this, that if you know somebody who is taking statins, that you get them to talk to a pharmacist. If they know a pharmacist or if they have a local pharmacist, because pharmacists know far more about drugs than doctors do, in any case. And they'll, if the pharmacist knows the dose that you're taking and knows, you know, what age you are and stuff like that, they'll probably be able to give you a much better idea than we could, because we'd just be guessing here about that. Well, thanks, Christina. It is Jason Fong, yes. So Jason Fong has done the obesity code and the diabetes code. Yeah. Now, another question from Eric, another interesting question. How would you recommend older people with very low cholesterol go about raising it?
Well, to be honest, I'm not sure that it's important, but if you really want to do it, then go to Dave Feldman stuff.
All right, so just let's answer by text. So what's the name? Is it Keto Dave, did you say?
Dave.
Keto Dave.
He's Dave Feldman, Feldman.
Is it ketodave.com or what?
Well, I think it is, but if you Google keto Dave and cholesterol, almost certainly will come up.
Yeah, okay. It'll probably work once, so we'll put that out there.
Anyway, any problem, let me know and I'll dig it out for you.
Yeah, good. Thanks very much for that. That's really good. Oh, okay. That's Christina. Thanks very much for that, Christina. It's cholesterolcode.com. So it's cholesterolcode, one word.com is the answer. Can you see that? Can everyone see these questions? I'm not sure they can. Anita, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, I'm here.
Hiya. Can you see the questions?
I can, yes. Yeah, you're done. Nikki's was the last.
Yeah, so
comment.
Everyone can see these comments and questions, can they?
Oh no, I don't think so. Unless the chat, if it's.
Oh no, Chris. Oh, Caroline says no. Okay.
Yeah.
So
okay.
all right. So what I'll do is I'll put this in. I didn't realize that I'm reading this stuff off and assuming everyone can see it. So answer by text to everyone. I suppose this goes to everyone. Did that go? cholesterolcode.com. Yes, it did. Oh, great. Thanks, Margaret. That's really good. Yeah. Okay, good. Excellent. Right. So that's. I hope that you haven't been left in the dark by some of my answers, or our answers. Good. That's great. Thank you. Good. Now, are there any other comments or questions you'd like to ask? Okay. This was great, wasn't it? I really enjoyed this. I hope you did too. I mean, obviously, for most people, this will raise lots of questions as well. And of course, there'll be lots of questions. And we have to remember that this is not a formula, this approach. It's not that everyone has to do something, you know, eat in a certain way. Everyone is different. And some people will respond much better to a low carb diet, much better, and will feel much better on it. And for other people, it won't make that much difference. But I think it's important. I think what's happening is that I think the notion of gradually becoming carbohydrate intolerant is a very useful way of thinking about it. In other words, that if you carry on eating as you get older, eating a diet which is high in carbs, and you start to develop some of these problems that we've discussed earlier, even if you're not diagnosed perhaps with anything, but if you're moving in that direction, particularly if you have a family history of this kind of problem, then it's very likely that you will benefit from reducing the carbs in your diet. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to do a ketogenic approach, but again, you might eventually get to the point where a ketogenic approach does work better for you than anything else. And as I said, we are different. We have to recognize that. It's really important, I think. So I suppose remains. I don't think there's are there any questions that I've missed? I don't think so. Just to say thank you very much indeed, Verner, for such an interesting presentation today, for raising so many issues and so much important stuff here for us all. As we all move towards older age, then these issues can become so important, can't they? And so many people will already be struggling with perhaps a family member or friends who may have issues. My mother's 95 and she has early stage Alzheimer's at the moment. So I know, this is important for her as well. And probably that I have the genes as well that might predispose me towards these things. So I think it's important that we at least educate ourselves around these things, don't you think? So,
Yes.
so do you have anything final words there, Werner?
Well, just that I think as well, I regard blood sugar as, you know, excessive blood sugar or blood glucose, and insulin for that matter, as corrosive elements inside your body.
As what?
Corrosive elements.
Yes, a corrosive element. Yeah, I agree. Totally agree.
An awful lot of damage, and
It does huge damage to
the longer it goes on, then the worse it will be. And you know, for many years,
the.
the body can fight it off, but eventually, I mean, that graph I showed, the insulin resistance, the huge difference in the incidence of diseases.
Yeah.
With a low insulin resistance, those in the high insulin resistance, is very telling. And I mean, to have a difference of, say, 25 to 1, and yet they're raving about drugs that show a 20% increase. It doesn't make sense.
No, unless you happen to have